5. All right, thanks very much. So we now come to the most important session. No, I'm kidding. All sessions were important, but it is true that there's an elephant in the room that we sometimes don't speak about, even though we should, and that's, of course, funding and money. And something we've been reflecting on for quite a bit as this focus group, because we, I hope you're convinced by now that we want to do something that's really important, and not just important, but potentially revolutionary. And this is, I think, something great and that a lot of us can get behind. But at the end of the day, we need, of course, the resources to do that as well. Which brings us into a tricky situation because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a non-mandated group. And a non-mandated group typically has no mandator that gives the resources. So we have to think a bit creatively about how we go that. We had 2 sessions at the previous 2 meetings that were interesting. But we try to do something a little bit different and bring in someone who's not directly from a foundation or who's not a VC, but who's actually been working in this world of philanthropy for a very, very long time. And that's Karin Jestin. And we invited her here partly because I had the privilege and continue hopefully to have the privilege to work with her. Some, full disclosure, some of my work at EPFL research is supported by a foundation that she used to sort of manage as part of the as part of her mandate when she was at Lombard Odier, the head of philanthropy. She has a very rich CV that I'm not going to read in detail, including McKinsey, including the International Committee of the Red Cross. She's now independent. And we're delighted to have her here to give us a few insights into philanthropy and just a general funding landscape. So, Karin, thanks for being here.
Hi, nice to see you all. I actually never did any fundraising. I thought I should say that because if you turn to me for fundraising advice, I might not be the right person at all. But I do know the other side, so what donors are looking for. And as Marcel approached me and wanted to have some insights on the funding landscape at large, and we are only at the very, very end going to have a tiny look at AI specifically, there are a couple of messages I want to pass, and this is going to be relatively short. But basically, if you look at the so-called funding continuum, you will have on one side what one could call giving, where the sole purpose is social impact and no financial return is sought. And then you have a gradient all the way to traditional investing. Traditional investing, in my view, should not exist anymore. This is investing that only seeks financial return with absolutely no attention to societal consequences. It is much huger than what the bubble indicates, but luckily the second bubble, socially responsible investing, is growing and growing quite fast. You see here the data of 2016, $23 trillion invested in SRI. That means either exclusion, so nothing that has to do with the military, nothing that has to do with smoking or alcohol, since you mentioned the difficulty of quitting smoking just earlier. But it can also be more proactive, where you, as an investor, decide on giving certain weights to environmental, social, or governance criteria, and will want to have your portfolio screened that way. And then there is this emerging bubble, actually a term that was coined by a team within Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, called social impact Rockefeller Foundation, called social impact investing. And this is blended, or, blended finance, some will call it. And even within that very still small but growing bubble, you distinguish between impact first investors and finance first investors. So the impact first will be more, and hence they are more towards the giving side of things, more ready to take risks. They will be able to be the first at losing if a deal doesn't work out, whereas the finance first already wants some level of security or some level of financial return guaranteed. And then on the giving side, and the bubbles are obviously very tiny compared to the finance world, so this is not in proportion again, but you will have public funding at large, which would be development aid, among others, governmental funding, intergovernmental funding. You will have philanthropy, which I characterize as already a strategic-oriented giving by either a foundation or very wealthy individuals who have an objective that they pursue through the giving. And then you'll have more generic funding and the recent, let's say, trend towards crowdfunding. But when you used to ask your mom and dad and your siblings to donate and cousins to donate, this would be, some kind of family crowdfunding already in existence. This is a slide I took from the group EVPA that you can see below. So there are different ways of representing it. This would be from the point of view of the organization itself. So everything that is in orange would be on the giving side from my previous slide. Primary driver is achieve social value, what some still call traditional charity. And then you see that it blends slowly. And in the beginning of social enterprises, you have those that are potentially self-sustaining, but still with market revenues, but still need giving. So they are at that fringe. And then the more you move towards the right, the more you move again towards traditional businesses, where it is CSR that is considered. And at the very right, you have the pure profit orientation businesses. If you really want to know more, The Economist published late last year a very interesting supplement with the support of the Omidyar Network created. Omidyar Network is also an interesting philanthropy/social business investing setup created by Pierre and Pam Omidyar. Pierre is co-founder of eBay. So you may want to dig into it more. Let me zoom now into philanthropy, but the first message I want you to keep in mind, unfortunately, about philanthropy is that we have very poor data. So we are going to work with Proxy Data, and at least the OECD has a center on philanthropy that looked at a development aid. So this would be philanthropy going abroad to support developing or least developed countries. Again, key message, public funding is by far the largest pool of granted funds. So on the right-hand side, you have the official development assistance, so-called ODA, and you can see the size of that bubble compared with the orange one, foundations giving for development. So philanthropy represents about 5% of ODA. And philanthropy for development comes dominantly from the US. So at the bottom, this huge bubble, and then you see UK, Netherlands, Switzerland, Canada, and a few others. Let me use the example of Switzerland that I happen to know a little bit more, just to give you an order of magnitude about why I call this proxy data. Here you see 600 million as the collected data, and this probably is data over a period 2015 for development aid coming from foundations. We, as a Swiss Foundation, so an organization that represents charitable foundation in Switzerland, have estimated that there is anywhere between 1 and 2 billion Swiss francs, which is more or less equivalent to a US dollar nowadays. So let's say 1 to 2 billion US dollars given out from foundation to society at large. So that, if we compare these two data, basically means that a bit more than half would stay within Switzerland, and the other half, or a bit less, would go abroad for development aid or would be included in that bubble. So I let you imagine in the US how larger the bubble actually is of philanthropy that does exist, but is not necessarily philanthropy that we can track very easily, though the US would probably be the place where it's tracked best. In other places, much more difficult. Good news for you, health is by far the main recipient of foundation grants. Here you have data. So the violet is health, the orange is reproductive health. Is the largest beneficiary of philanthropic giving. More than half of all the funds for development over the same period, 2013, 2015, went to that field. And there is one elephant in the room, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is by far the main contributor. You have a little footnote that says that actually their bar chart needed to be adjusted, reduced by 20% so that it fitted in the diagram. Under it, you have also a US foundation, the Susan Buffett Foundation, then CIF, I don't know if you're all familiar with them, Children Investment Fund Foundation in the UK, Wellcome Trust in the UK, Bloomberg Philanthropies US, Slim Foundation Mexico, Hewlett Foundation US, Tata Trust India, Dutch Postcode Lottery in the Netherlands, and UBS Optimus Foundation in Switzerland. Obviously, these numbers are a couple of years old, so the ranking may have varied. What certainly still is there is elephant size of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we're very thankful for that. Again, if you want to know more, all these data and more are available on the website of the OECD Center on Philanthropy, and so you can dive in and slice it the way that best fits you. Now, let me give you a couple of insights based on my experience as donor. To oversimplify things, and please do keep in mind that I'm oversimplifying, I would say there could be, ideally, a kind of division of labor in the giving landscape. Crowdfunding is one that is emotional. You tell me a story. I really think that you're a great person, that, I emotionally relate to what you're telling me. Yes, I want to support you. I'm going to give. Not really much question asked, not a lot of reporting, but you maybe will have to feed this emotional bond that we have created. Not unsimilar with the way you fundraise with your family members, and certainly not unsimilar with the way some very wealthy individuals still decide, without the rigor of looking actually at what you are going to deliver, how you are going to deliver it, and whether you have the backing and the strategy and just the theory of change in place. So I would say this is probably best suited for early idea maturing, when you are still toying with an idea. Then there is what I would call philanthropic funding, so coming from classical foundation that usually should have a strategy in place. They should be relatively quick in decision making, relatively unbureaucratic, and can afford to take risks. I have been pleading that in the field, that philanthropic funders should take risks because they can afford it, where, let's say, government from democratically elected countries cannot afford, because they need to report back to the electorate and demonstrate that they have used the money wisely. So I would say this would be best suited for early piloting phases. But once a pilot is sort of demonstrated as valid, or has been tinkered with and is, has some validity and proof of impact, then we should be able to bring it to public funding. Public funding applications, you probably have gone through that process already, are usually complex, lengthy, cumbersome, but huge volumes. So there is a trade-off there. So I believe it's, ideally at the replication stage that we should use them. Now, what does a foundation tend to look for? And maybe it's slanted, maybe it's more, what does Karen look for when she looks at a project? But through their giving, foundation, if I put it in very simple terms, they buy future impact in their area of interest. So you need to demonstrate how your idea, your project, your initiative is going to deliver in the coming years the impact that they are seeking, or in the field that they are seeking. They will generally look at both the soundness of the project you are putting forward, but also at the solidity of the organization. And I've listed a couple of criteria here at the project level. How good is your understanding of the context? Can you really convince me that, yes, you have sought that feedback from your quote-unquote beneficiaries or people you want to help? How sound is your quote-unquote, this is jargon of the sector, your theory of change, the way you believe you're going to impact change? Has it been tested somewhere else? Have you adapted from other fields? What are the proof points or the reasons why or how you will convince me that yes, there is some traction there. What are the expected outputs and better expected impact? Do you have realistic implementation activities means in terms of staff, in terms of infrastructure and timeline, and how solid is your project team? Now, as I often tell funders also, we don't expect you to be plus, plus, plus on all of them. Otherwise, you wouldn't be knocking at our door. And especially on the right-hand side, so the organizational strengths. You know, we love best-in-class organization, but we also know that in certain circumstances, or especially if you also want to have grassroots organization, where you will also support the development of talents on the ground, you will have to compromise with, you know, some certainties that others could provide you with, but that's a choice to be made. At the organizational level, you know, how clear is the strategy? How solid is the governance and a leadership team, and how well functioning is the dialogue between the two? What is the funding structure to date? What are existing partners? I will not hesitate also to ask for a reference and call up that partner and say, what has been your experience to date? You know, how are they operating? Are they good on feedback? Are they transparent or not? What have been your past successes and impact to date that you can claim for yourself? That being said, I'm sorry for this little note, there is a saying in our sector, which is, when you know one foundation, well, you know one foundation. And you have to start all over again with another foundation. So always keep in mind that a foundation led, not an institutional one that would have been created by a government, sometimes that exists as well, but especially foundations that have been created by people, individuals, they will tend to resemble these people. And actually, people in that sector like it, that they are specific and known for their specificity, even if there tends to be a professionalization in the sector. And as professionals, we tend to have, you know, common standards and debate around approaches and way of operating. This was probably in this same room, a colleague of mine, Claudia Genier, who is Deputy Director of Swiss Foundation here in the French-speaking part, at the so-called EPFL Foundation Days, who used this slide. So this would be only in Switzerland, but again, it's to give you orders of magnitude. There is a pool of 2,500 foundations focusing on research and science. That means, you know, many potential funders. Foundations have their purpose and action mode as DNA. Same quote. Big grants do exist, also in Europe and Switzerland, not just in the US, but there are also plenty of tiny little grants, not necessarily needing less efforts. Obtaining private research funding is time-consuming, and it is worth building trustful relationships with specific foundations, as many funders give recurrent grants, trust being a key component of that relationship. Individual relationships. Maybe last slide, just going to AI. This, I think, is a very recent field of grant making for foundations. Though you have some excerpts from already a couple of years ago, this would be people rather from the sector at large. For example, the Paul Allen Family Foundation. You have recent, very large gifts that were made just before Christmas. Northeastern University received 50 million to further AI studies. You have the Knight Foundation that is a bit in the field here in Switzerland. You have the Botnar Foundation. But I also like the quote below, which is, and you know that, obviously, as much as I said what foundations are looking for, you should be also looking into which foundation are you ready to partner with or not. Digital leader strategy is not to fund university labs. It is to compete with them. Voilà, that would be my final report. I'm open for questions.
So we're open for questions, but I first want to ask mine. Take that privilege now. So can we go back to the slides, please? But there was this one slide where you had this oversimplification, which is an oversimplification, as you said. So yeah. So this first or second slide. So yeah, next. Yep, that's good. So seems to me that you would, I mean, knowing what you know about us, and I know it's not much, but from what I told you, but you would, seems to me that we are in the middle ground here because we're a bit beyond idea maturing, I would argue, a bit biased. Would you agree with that? And can you also just still say a few words about crowdfunding? In the beginning, I thought you mentioned these new kinds of platforms digitally, but then you said that also includes wealthy individuals, which probably don't go on these platforms.
No, but sorry, so but operate with the same motives. So I was rather saying, you know, what is it these different actors are looking for?
Yeah.
And in the first category, which is typical of crowdfunding nowadays, but it's an emotional connection.
Yep.
Which is obviously also the case of, you know, mom and dad. Yeah. But also I need to reckon individuals. I mean, recently was at a board meeting with a very wealthy family, and they still operate in that manner where it is le coup de cœur, literally. That emotional connection that makes a difference. And then on all the strategic and sort of more rigorous criteria I mentioned, they are ready to compromise a lot for that factor. Mm-hmm. So you still have some there. This is why I say this is an oversimplification, and there will be many exceptions on one side or the other. To your first question about whether you are best suited for the middle column, probably. But one piece of work we still need to do is I'm not quite sure of the amount you are looking for. So, you know, the big funders we looked at, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the SIF, and so on, for them it's the same transaction cost to fund 10,000 that it is to fund 10 million. So they will not fund 10,000. On top of that, maybe I should have mentioned, you may be aware, in the US, there is a so-called 5% rule. So foundation by law need to spend in grants every year at least 5% of their assets. Now, when you know the wealth of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to which Warren Buffett added a whole lot, there is what in the jargon we called an absorption capacity problem, when our grantees cannot digest so many funds. So literally large foundations like this have a problem of shoveling money out of the door. So they will only go for very large grants. And so then it seems to me that you're not quite suited yet, or I haven't fully defined a reality of the scope of your work.
Yep.
So this, the focus is different than a specific project where you would say, hey, I can do this and then I can heal this type of cancer. Please give me money here. Here we are really presenting a mechanism that could lead to to improvements. How would you see, should we maybe present, instead of present a certain mechanism to foundations, for instance, say, if you support somebody participating because they don't have their own funds, so they need to come and they need to provide data, etc., then if that's supported, for example, then the result must be made publicly available and it can be used everywhere in the world, also in Africa, everywhere in the world. Is it possible? Do you consider it possible that we present such a mechanism as a funding principle instead of we can't just say we have this cancer project. We have cancer projects, but it would be very short-sighted to ask for every single project that comes in. We are looking at an activity here in a year from now where we have maybe 100 active projects, right? So if we ask for every project for funding, that would be a nightmare. So how do we?
So I mean, this is where I think we need to go a bit in brainstorming mode. One way could be to say, you know, fund the process of us getting together. And yes, your idea of funding delegates is something that is known out there, and some foundations are happy to do that. but it's specific foundation. Obviously, most, and especially when you're on the left-hand side, the emotional ones, unless they know the delegate, or unless they come from that country and they think it's very important that you have, representation from Ghana attending these type of meetings because they want to grow that talent pool in their home country. Unless you find this emotional tie, they will not be interested. Because the emotion, sorry to say, guys, but it's boring to see you sitting in a meeting room like this and to imagine that you're sitting in a meeting room like this for 3 days. So not very sexy, So, oh, better even, wonderful. But I know the cocktail is going to be great. Okay, so. And again, I believe these are small amount of money, so why not? But in a way, I heard that there is some generosity of the Swiss government for us being able to be fed tonight. Thank you very much. You could very well say we have a partnership with the Swiss embassies, and embassies from each country are ready to pay for 1 or 2 delegates. Because you will want to minimize also the workload for yourself, not having to knock at individual doors and making separate agreements. So for you, the challenge is how do we package your needs in a meaningful way that basically suits, it's a square in the peg image, but that suits whatever your donor is going to be. In a way, these process-oriented mechanisms, governments understand better than foundations. So, because they are used to intergovernmental panels, they are used to these processes, and they understand the value. Again, I'm not quite sure of what is the order of magnitude of what you're looking for. Oh, yeah, sure. But globally, I'm not sure what the order of magnitude of, rough number. Give me a rough number.
The rough number is a sufficient amount to make this focus group have a large impact on the world health.
Okay, bottom line. Yeah, yeah, but give me just an order of magnitude. 5, 6, 7, 8 digits.
It should be.
I heard 8.
We have asked we have a proposal written down for 2 million euros of Swiss francs.
That was not shared with me.
Yeah, but it's
yeah?
we have just started doing it, and we're not experienced in this domain. We are more experienced in other domains. So it's really and we kind of everything is done voluntarily so far. And for instance, we had a big conference call with somebody. They said, yeah, we have cases that we can bring right away, but we are a membership organization and we don't have the funds to send people over to Europe to participate. So then, and if we had the funds to finance that trip at least, they could, for instance, come bring their cases and then work with us, for example. And we just come across lots of these things. Then we don't have computing resources and storage capacity. We don't have any mechanism to roll things out after we have actually been evaluating them. So we have this snakebite project. It has this shortcoming that you have to take a photo of a snake. I don't know whether everybody who gets bitten by a snake thinks about taking a photo afterwards. But if they don't know about that they should take a photo, then this thing will go nowhere. So we have to have probably a campaign after we validated the snakebite project that in those countries where snake bites are relevant, people start considering taking a photo of the snake that bit them in order to benefit from it. So there's also like bring the cases, curate them to the point where they actually we can deal with them, and then once we have a result, start to work on mechanisms to roll them out, and in particular in those countries that are far away from AI and health. So that can be lots of money.
Absolutely. Quick reaction would be to, again, in the packaging approach, to do it stage-wise. So to segregate in phases, and ideally to find interlocutors that are open-minded and daring enough to say, oh, I see the larger vision and the future impact, and that you need to make as tangible as possible through examples, even fictive examples, but to try to help them appreciate how much it's going to deliver value to the world in the future. That makes it worthwhile, for them to invest upfront and say, right now we are only asking for a very tiny chunk. It's actually, for you to also gain access to the brains in the room, to gain access to this community, to be on the learning journey with us. And then you need to spell out all the value added to them. It's a selling job. But before selling, you need to package it. First you need obviously to know what you're doing, and you are already at that stage. You have already enough meetings that, you know where you are headed. But you need to continue. Right now, if I understood properly, because it's a self-organized group and self-mandated group, you went the organic route. You learned as you walked and you continued, and you have lots of experience that you're bringing to the table. Now let's project that out a little bit. Let's try to draw it out. Your shot to the moon. So draw the SpaceX before SpaceX existed, that type of approach. And then it's still, who are the potential interested interlocutors? And they are not necessarily we will think of, but we will need to knock at certain doors. Some, there are probably some others out there, and it may be in a para-governmental institution that you hadn't thought about, in an odd country that you hadn't thought about. It may be an individual, I don't know. Did you know the guy who just gave 50 million to Northeastern? 50 million. So, okay, it is alma mater that we're pretty sure of. This is a traditional way in the US, but there are some wealthy individuals from some of the institutions you all come from that are worth approaching.
We have another question here.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think this is really valuable to the focus group. And my question would be a follow-up to Professor Wiegand, in the sense that what inspires me so much about this focus group is that it actually builds an infrastructure that allows many other projects to become more sustainable and better. And I see a very clearly a value in that, but I can also understand that it's complicated to address
to
that
grasp.
and to communicate that. So following up.
So give me 3 good examples in the past, in other industries, other sectors, I don't care, but where infrastructure like this, similar to what you are building, has had a huge impact.
The internet, many things, many ICT security technologies you build on the internet that would be used in other, if you go to, I'm not an ICT expert, so there's more qualified people to answer that, especially in the aspect of health and ICT. But you mean this would be a strategy to look what others have done and how they communicated that, or because it's always the problem with infrastructure. It's like if it's there, you don't know it's there, and everybody relies on it. But if it's not there, it's very hard to tell people that it's actually necessary. And,
it's not so much for you to learn how they have done, though there might be some useful insight, but I think the world may have changed so rapidly that maybe not. It's much more to convince, again, your future interlocutors that look at this example, what the plan I'm designing for you, and I ask you to follow me in my thinking and to trust my thinking, but actually I have proof points about why it was valid elsewhere at another time in another sector. It doesn't really matter, but you need to choose them wisely so that they resonate. And suddenly there is an aha moment in your interlocutor's mind that says, oh, now I get it. And wow, I could be actually potentially, if you're in the first column, associated with this wow effect. Okay, if we're in the second column, you would rather need to have metrics. And also, I think if you are with small governmental donors. Sorry, but you may, I interrupted you twice. I'm sorry, but I wanted to address your points. Are we done? Yeah.
Actually, my question was, this was the first part, but then if you have some do's and don'ts, because you have a rich experience, and I know it from my very small experience of grading seminar papers from students. Sometimes they do things that are really disqualify them, even though they might have good ideas, but you cannot grade them well afterwards. And sometimes they do just genius things, which really knocks the ball out of the park. And but I understand that you gave one example of a very good of a good communication, in the sense that if we find use cases that have a similar impact as a kind of infrastructure, this would increase understanding. Or are there any other do's and don'ts from your practical experience that could apply?
There is one quote that came to my mind. There is no such thing as an idea whose time has come. So strengthen, really like you would take a diamond and tailor it so that it shines. Make your idea understandable and shiny. The other thing is infectious passion. I once worked on a project. We had absolutely zero funding. We had no connection, but we had one idea of an artist in Paris a while back. Marcel even doesn't know about that. We opened doors we wouldn't even think we could open. We got commitment from Arianespace, from EADS, from people from the space agencies we had no clue and no connection to. But somehow there was this, idea that touched people, plus then the plan that was realistic and sound. And then you need to bring people onto your journey. And there is no such thing as human connection for that.
More questions? There's a question. You got one too. Maybe we can bring one mic there.
I have a question and a comment.
The contribution by country. I'm curious, since Bill and Melinda Gates had such an impact, I'm curious what their donations look like compared to the rest of the earth. Actually, right there, that one. So previous slide?
Yeah, 9 out of 17 or 18, so half. So a lot. Take all the others together.
I was going to say, it's all the others together.
For development aid, in-house. As you know, they are also very large in education in the US. But, something that would not be on this chart, recently you may have heard the commitment of actually a Swiss gentleman living in the US, also a signatory to the Giving Pledge, who committed 1 billion to help protect 1/3 of the planet by 2033. So you have these huge commitments. You may also have heard 2 days ago at Davos, the announcement by Oxfam that 28 top billionaires own as much as half of the world population. So it's a bit sobering as a piece of data, but at least some of them are generous.
All right, this one there.
Maybe we cut the camera there.
Hi, Arun Shroff here, and thanks for your presentation and insights. They were really great. As a person who had a project in the past meeting, a very small project, I haven't looked at these alternatives that you just talked about, and so that's why this is interesting. Could you just talk a little bit about what percentage of projects that a typical foundation looks at are actually funded? For example, I know the VC world, it's a very, very small, it's like a minuscule, like 0.1% or 1%. And they actually wear that as a badge of pride, saying we get 2,000 applications, but we only fund 1, which is extremely discouraging, of course. But so I would think a foundation would probably fund a greater percentage of projects that they receive. So that's my first question. The second question is, usually what's the quantum of funding that a foundation would give? Because a lot of people here are very passionate about the causes that they're looking at, and a small amount goes very far. So, a pilot, would a foundation typically do it in stages where they fund a pilot study first to prove that your concept works, and then once you've proven it, you're reducing the risk, right? So they would then say, okay, come back to us after 6 months. So what's the process typically? Because I understand how it works in the VC world, but...
So I wish I could say typically, but, I'll just give you a few data points. First, one element I didn't allude to, but know that in Switzerland, less than 20% of the grant-making foundation have staff. So that means that it's a foundation board, usually the donor, maybe, the spouse, or another member of the family, maybe a lawyer who created the foundation, maybe a banker who wants to keep managing the assets, maybe a friend, very rarely someone knowledgeable to the field. So beware of this gap about how much they know, and actually part of your job in bringing up a project is also the education of your interlocutor. To your point of how many, because there is so little staff, and I now work as an advisor for several foundations who don't have staff, so I'm like a shared resource for them. We have a practice where we say, we are really sorry, but we will not accept unsolicited proposal. We will only go out and seek proposal in the field of our interest, because otherwise that would, suck up too much basically of our administrative time, and we cannot afford that. Others cannot do that. So I'll give you an example of a foundation that gives about $1 million a year. We probably agree to 8 or 9 projects a year, and it's a multi-year engagement. So grosso modo, that's the volume. I recently heard that the person who mans the foundation receives 900 requests a year. And we probably she probably looks at 30, 40, then, brings it down to what goes to the board. And we look at maybe 10 or 12. We rarely refuse projects that have come to us because they have been vetted, but the proportion is obviously very small. And I don't think that's unusual if you accept unsolicited proposals. Now, in your case, I don't think there are that many foundations yet that understand your field, or at least for the project as you described it. Now, some, AI against cancer or against tobacco or, something like this may then interest funders that are already active in this field and are looking for innovative ways to address the same field.
Okay, great, thanks.
And I think you had a question on how much will a foundation usually put in. It is actually interesting as a combination of our 2 columns using the matching fund mechanism. If you have a government, for example, that is, understands what you are doing but cannot afford to put all the funding, they could, say that they match any private funding, or vice versa. A private funder may do that. It is, if you want, the reverse mechanism of a tax incentive. As you say, if someone donates, I'm going to double or triple the amount. And so they are going to have so much more bang for their buck, as Americans say.
All right. Well, let me take the privilege of asking the last question. So I think you made it abundantly clear, right? This kind of fundraising is an art. And if you know something about one particular foundation mechanism, you know nothing except about that particular funding mechanism, as opposed to, for example, VC funding, where it's very clear what everyone's optimizing, scientific, academic funding, classical. It's also clear, although a bit more, not quite as clear, but maybe closer than in what you describe. Basically comes down to individuals making decisions, often with a gut feeling, and we can even argue that they probably even, each of them sort of measure the impact individually. There's no standards whatsoever. Would that roughly be correct? That's not the question. But would it be roughly correct?
Yeah, I'll give you, it's roughly correct, unfortunately. It might be sometimes more than emotional, reaction of one individual. It may be a professional team. But I'll give you an example of a collaborative. We are 11 funders funding into a collaborative that supports the same theme, and we have 1 program director. So she's a grant maker for us. She still reports to the 11 foundation on different templates. And I said, sorry, no. There is going to be 1, and if you want me to go and knock door by door and tell them that there is going to be just 1 reporting standard for everyone, and they adjust it into their system if they need, I'll do it. But she didn't dare because, you don't want to offend your donor and so on and so forth.
Okay, but having said all of that, is there still something that you think, everyone should know about this and that everyone seems to get wrong? So, this is really sort of one of my favorite.
Do you have something in mind?
No.
From
but
your experience, Marcel.
but absolutely not. No, because I have no experience in that. But I often think this is an interesting question. So in the startup world, for example, when I recently came across this quote, and they asked Mark Andreessen, who's some of the major VC in the world, like what's the thing that the advice that every startup should have, but nobody seems to follow it? And he said, raise your prices. And so, is there something that seems to work well? Is there something that equivalent in this world where everyone should kind of know it? It's obvious, but everybody seems to get it wrong. And I'm putting you on a spot here, so you can also maybe if you could in an hour.
Do it after a couple of drinks. Yeah,
exactly.
I would certainly not necessarily that everyone would agree, but I would use the same advice because make your effort worth it. Now, do invest time. Don't knock at the doors, a bit haphazardly or unprepared. Do go in very well prepared, but do raise the bar. And I'll tell you another, also coming from a VC. Actually, a VC had sent a friend some business, and he wanted to return the favor and invited him for lunch. And so finally, there is a lunch date agreed, and they sit down for lunch. And the VC goes, "So, what's the idea?" And the guy said, "Oh no, I just wanted to thank you." And he was like, "What?" He's like, "You're losing my time." Basically, he didn't express it that way. So don't lose anyone's time either.
Yeah.
You like that?
Hello.
I like that.
Good.
Can I chime in?
We have to close it here. Thanks once again to Karin.
It's a pleasure.